They whispered her name like a curse in the dusty streets of El Paso. Clara Johnson, rancher's poison, the woman whose touch supposedly brought death to any man foolish enough to court her. 3 suitors had died, and the town's verdict was final. She was marked by darkness. But when the Apache warrior Tenoch first saw her standing alone at her father's grave, he saw not poison, but a wildflower growing in barren soil. The wind carried his words across the desert that day. "She'll be my wife by spring." In a land where love was luxury and survival was law, 2 outcasts would discover that sometimes the most dangerous thing is not the curse others place upon you, but the courage to break it. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Johnson ranch, but Clara felt only the chill that had settled in her bones since the day they buried her father. She stood at the kitchen window, watching the dust devils dance across the barren fields, her calloused hands gripping the tin cup of coffee that had grown cold hours ago. The silence of the house pressed against her like a living thing, heavy with the weight of unspoken accusations and the ghost of her father's disappointed sighs. 3 men had courted her in the past 2 years, and 3 men had died. Tom Fletcher thrown from his horse, Billy Morrison taken by fever, and young Samuel Wright shot down in a saloon fight the very night he'd asked for her hand. The town had drawn its conclusion with the swift certainty of a hanging judge. Clara Johnson was cursed, a bringer of death, rancher's poison in a pretty dress. She moved through the empty rooms like a spectre herself, her footsteps echoing on the worn wooden floors that had once known the sound of her mother's laughter and her father's heavy boots. The ranch hands had quit one by one after her father's funeral, crossing themselves when they thought she wasn't looking, muttering prayers in Spanish as they collected their final pay. Now the corrals stood empty. The barn doors creaked in the wind like the groans of dying men, and the cattle had been sold off to pay debts that seemed to multiply like tumbleweeds after a storm. Clara had become the sole inhabitant of a kingdom of dust and regret, a queen ruling over nothing but the whispered fears of a superstitious town. The mirror in her bedroom reflected a face that had grown gaunt with isolation, green eyes that had learned to expect rejection before hope could take root. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke through her reverie like a gunshot in the desert silence. Clara set down her cup and moved to the front porch, her hand instinctively smoothing the faded blue dress that had once been her Sunday best. A lone rider approached from the east, his silhouette wavering in the heat like a mirage, and as he drew closer, Clara felt her breath catch in her throat. He was Apache. She could tell from the way he sat his horse, the proud set of his shoulders, the long black hair that caught the morning light, like raven's wings. The townspeople would have reached for their rifles at the sight of him, but Clara felt only a strange stirring in her chest, a recognition that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the loneliness that had been her constant companion. He reined in his horse at the edge of her property, close enough that she could see the strong lines of his face, the intelligent dark eyes that seemed to look right through her carefully constructed walls. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the dusty yard, 2 outcasts separated by more than just the space between them, separated by race, by culture, by the invisible barriers that their respective worlds had built around them. Clara felt exposed under his gaze, as if he could see not just her face, but the wounded heart that beat beneath her ribs, the desperate hunger for acceptance that she had tried so hard to bury. The wind picked up, sending her skirts dancing around her ankles and carrying with it the scent of sage and something else, something wild and free that made her think of open skies and endless horizons. When he finally spoke, his voice carried across the distance between them like a prayer whispered in a cathedral. "You are the one they call poison," he said, and Clara flinched as if he had struck her, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. But there was no mockery in his tone, no fear or disgust, only a quiet observation, as if he were commenting on the color of the sky or the direction of the wind. She lifted her chin defiantly, prepared to defend herself against yet another accusation, but the words died in her throat when she saw the way he was looking at her. There was something in his eyes that she had never seen before in any man's gaze. Not pity, not fear, but a kind of recognition, as if he was seeing something in her that even she didn't know existed. "I am Tenoch," he said simply, and the name fell between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the careful silence Clara had built around herself. "And you are not poison." The certainty in his voice made her heart skip like a startled rabbit, and for the first time in months, Clara felt the ice around her heart begin to crack, letting in a sliver of something that might have been hope if she had dared to name it. The days that followed Tenoch's first visit blurred together like watercolors in the rain, each one bringing him back to the edge of her property where he would sit on his horse and watch her with those dark, knowing eyes. Clara found herself looking forward to these silent encounters with a desperation that frightened her, rushing through her morning chores so she could position herself on the porch, where she might catch a glimpse of his proud silhouette against the endless Texas sky. He never came closer than that first day, never spoke again, but his presence had become as essential to her as breathing, a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman who had forgotten what it felt like to hope. The townspeople had begun to notice his appearances, their whispered conversations growing more urgent, their glances more pointed when Clara ventured into town for supplies. She could feel their fear like a living thing, crawling across her skin and settling in her bones, but for the first time in her life, she found she didn't care what they thought. On the seventh day, as autumn painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Tenoch finally dismounted from his horse and walked across the dusty yard toward her porch. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird as she watched him approach, noting the fluid grace of his movements, the way the morning light caught the copper tones in his skin. He wore traditional Apache clothing, buckskin leggings and a shirt decorated with intricate beadwork that told stories she couldn't read but somehow understood in her soul. When he reached the bottom of the porch steps, he stopped and looked up at her with an intensity that made her feel as if she were standing naked in the desert sun. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope, filled with all the words they had never spoken and all the longing that had been building in Clara's chest like a storm waiting to break. "They say you bring death to the men who love you," Tenoch said finally, his voice low and rich like honey poured over gravel. Clara felt the familiar stab of pain at the words, the automatic flinch that had become second nature whenever someone mentioned her supposed curse. But before she could retreat behind the walls she had built around her heart, Tenoch continued, and his next words hit her like lightning striking dry earth. "I say, they are fools who do not know the difference between a woman and a weapon." He climbed the steps, slowly, deliberately, each footfall echoing in the morning air like a drumbeat, until he stood before her close enough that she could smell the sage and leather scent of his skin, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "I have watched you," he said, and Clara felt her cheeks burn with a mixture of embarrassment and something deeper, something that made her pulse quicken and her breath come short. "I have seen how you tend the graves of the men who died, how you leave wildflowers on their stones, even though their families curse your name. I have seen how you feed the stray dogs that wander onto your land, how you mend the fence posts, even though you have no cattle left to contain. You are not poison, Clara Johnson. You are medicine for a world that has forgotten how to heal." The way he spoke her name made it sound like a prayer, like something sacred and beautiful, instead of the curse it had become in the mouths of the townspeople. Clara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back, afraid that if she showed weakness now, this moment would shatter like glass and leave her more broken than before. Tenoch reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, but Clara found herself frozen in place, as his calloused fingers traced the line of her jaw with a gentleness that made her soul ache. "My people have a saying," he murmured, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone with the lightness of a butterfly's wing. "The cactus flower blooms most beautiful in the harshest desert, because it knows that beauty without struggle has no meaning. You have struggled, Clara. You have been tested by fire and wind and the cruelty of small minds, and you have not broken. You have become something rare and precious, a woman who knows her own worth even when the world tells her she has none." His words wrapped around her like a warm blanket on a cold night, filling the empty spaces in her heart that she had thought would remain hollow forever. When he stepped back, Clara felt the loss of his touch like a physical pain, but the look in his eyes kept her anchored to the moment, kept her from drowning in the familiar sea of self-doubt. "I will come for you when the spring flowers bloom," Tenoch said, his voice carrying the weight of a sacred vow. "I will make you my wife, and together we will show both our peoples that love is stronger than fear, that two hearts joined in truth can overcome any curse." The declaration hung in the air between them like a challenge thrown down before the gods themselves, bold and dangerous and beautiful in its absolute certainty. Clara opened her mouth to speak, to protest, to ask how such a thing could ever be possible. But Tenoch was already walking away, his footsteps sure and steady as he returned to his horse and swung into the saddle with fluid grace. As she watched him ride away into the shimmering heat of the desert, Clara felt something shift inside her chest, like a door that had been locked for years, finally creaking open to let in the light. For the first time since the whispers had started, since the town had branded her with their superstitious fear, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was not cursed after all. Maybe she was simply waiting for the right man to see past the poison to the woman beneath. The morning sun painted the desert in shades of copper and gold when Clara found herself walking toward the Apache camp, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird, desperate for freedom. She had told no one of her destination, slipping away from the ranch before dawn, while her father still slept off another night of whiskey and regret. The weight of Tenoch's words had settled into her bones during the sleepless hours, and she knew that if she did not seek him out, she would spend the rest of her days wondering what courage might have tasted like. Her boots crunched against the hardpan earth, each step taking her further from the world that had rejected her and closer to something that felt both terrifying and inevitable. The wind carried the scent of sage and possibility, and for the first time in years, Clara Johnson felt truly alive. As she crested the small rise that overlooked the Apache settlement, she saw him standing beside his horse, as if he had been waiting for her all along. Tenoch watched her approach with eyes that held no surprise, only a quiet satisfaction that seemed to flow through him like water through parched earth. He had known she would come, had felt it in the way the wind had shifted during the night, carrying her restless spirit across the miles between them. The other warriors had questioned his declaration about the white woman, their voices sharp with concern and ancient wisdom, but he had silenced them with a look that spoke of decisions already carved in stone. Now, seeing her walking toward him with her chin raised and her green eyes blazing with determination, he felt the rightness of his choice settle deep in his chest. She moved like a woman who had finally stopped running from herself, and the sight stirred something primal and protective within him. When she stopped just beyond arm's reach, the space between them crackling with unspoken promises, he knew that the spring could not come soon enough. Her presence here, in defiance of everything her world had taught her, was the first gift she had given him. "I came to tell you that you're a fool," Clara said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands, and Tenoch smiled at the fire in her words, recognizing the courage it had taken for her to cross the invisible line that separated their worlds. She stood before him like a wildflower that had somehow learned to bloom in the harshest soil, beautiful and stubborn and utterly unexpected. The morning light caught the auburn threads in her hair, and he found himself wondering what it would feel like to run his fingers through those silken strands, to claim the right to touch what no other man had been permitted to cherish. "Every man who has tried to court me has met with misfortune," she continued, her green eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt or fear. "They call me poison for good reason, and if you persist in this madness, you'll likely find yourself cursed, along with all the rest." But even as she spoke the words of warning, her body betrayed her true feelings, leaning slightly toward him like a compass needle finding true north. The space between them hummed with electricity, and Tenoch felt his certainty grow stronger with each passing moment. "Perhaps," Tenoch replied, his voice low and rich as honey poured over stone, "the men of your town were simply too weak to handle a woman with real fire in her blood." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough that the warmth of his body seemed to wrap around her like a blanket against the morning chill. "A warrior does not fear the storm, Clara Johnson. He learns to dance with it." The way he spoke her name, with reverence and possession intertwined, sent shivers racing down her spine and made her forget for a moment all the reasons why this was impossible. His presence was overwhelming in the best possible way, solid and real and utterly unafraid of whatever darkness others claimed to see in her. She had expected him to be different in the daylight, perhaps less certain, less magnetic, but instead he seemed even more substantial, as if the sun had only served to illuminate the strength that had been hidden in shadow. When he reached out and touched her cheek with fingers that were surprisingly gentle, she felt something inside her chest crack open like an egg, releasing years of carefully guarded hope. The touch of his hand against her skin was like lightning striking dry timber, igniting something that Clara had thought was dead and buried beneath years of rejection and shame. She closed her eyes and leaned into his palm, allowing herself this one moment of tenderness before the world inevitably intruded with its harsh realities and impossible demands. "My father will never accept this," she whispered, her voice thick with longing and despair. "Your people will never accept me. We're from different worlds, Tenoch, and some bridges simply cannot be built." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were lies born of fear rather than truth. Because standing here with him, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing and the warmth of his touch, she could envision a world where love was stronger than prejudice, where two hearts could create their own tribe. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone with infinite care, as if he were memorizing the geography of her face, and she felt herself falling into the dark pools of his eyes like a woman diving into deep, welcoming water. The morning air around them seemed to shimmer with possibility, and Clara realized that she was no longer the same woman who had walked away from town before dawn. "Then we will build our own world," Tenoch said simply, his words carrying the weight of absolute conviction, and Clara felt her last defenses crumble like walls made of sand before an incoming tide. He spoke as if creating a new reality was as simple as deciding to do so, and his certainty was so complete, so unshakable, that she found herself beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, it could be true. The sun climbed higher in the sky above them, painting the desert in brilliant shades of gold and amber, and Clara Johnson made a choice that would change the course of her life forever. She stepped closer to the Apache warrior who had seen past her supposed curse to the woman beneath, close enough that their bodies were almost touching, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin like warmth from a fire on a cold night. "By spring," she whispered, the words falling from her lips like a prayer and a promise combined. And when Tenoch smiled, she knew that she had finally found her way home. The news of Clara's visit to the Apache camp spread through El Paso like wildfire through dry grass, carried on the tongues of those who had nothing better to do than watch their neighbors' business and judge what they did not understand. By noon, the whispers had reached every corner of the small town, growing more scandalous with each retelling until the simple truth had been twisted into something dark and shameful. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, clutched her pearls and declared that Clara had finally revealed her true nature, while the men gathered outside the saloon spoke in hushed tones about the dangers of allowing such behavior to go unchecked. The general consensus was that Clara Johnson had crossed a line from which there could be no return, and that her father needed to take action before she brought even more disgrace upon their family name. But Clara, walking through the town with her head held high and her green eyes blazing with newfound purpose, seemed untouched by their judgment, as if she had discovered a source of strength that made their opinions irrelevant. The transformation in her was visible to anyone who cared to look, a confidence that radiated from her like heat from sun-warmed stone. Thomas Johnson sat in his study that evening, a half-empty bottle of whiskey at his elbow, and his daughter's defiant words echoing in his mind like the tolling of a funeral bell. She had told him everything, holding nothing back, her voice steady and sure as she described her meeting with the Apache warrior and the promise that hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. The old rancher felt the weight of his failures pressing down upon him. The knowledge that his inability to protect his daughter from the town's cruelty had driven her into the arms of a man who represented everything their world feared and despised. He thought of his late wife, of the promises he had made to love and cherish their child, and wondered how he had allowed things to come to this desperate pass. The whiskey burned his throat as he drank, but it could not wash away the taste of his own inadequacy or the growing certainty that he was about to lose the only thing in this world that truly mattered to him. Outside his window, the desert wind howled like a creature in pain, and Thomas Johnson felt his heart breaking with the sound. Clara stood at her bedroom window, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast Texas sky, her mind filled with images of dark eyes and gentle hands, and words spoken with the authority of absolute truth. The memory of Tenoch's touch still lingered on her skin like a brand, marking her as his in ways that went deeper than flesh and bone. She could feel the town's disapproval pressing against the walls of the house like a living thing, hungry and malevolent. But for the first time in her life, their judgment held no power over her. She had tasted freedom in the form of a warrior's promise, had seen herself reflected in eyes that held no fear or superstition, only desire and respect, and something that might, in time, grow into love. The spring seemed both impossibly far away and dangerously close, a deadline that would either deliver her into a new life or destroy everything she had ever known. As she prepared for bed, Clara whispered a prayer to whatever gods might be listening, asking not for safety or certainty, but for the courage to see this path through to its end. The night air carried the scent of sage and possibility, and she fell asleep dreaming of copper skin and promises kept. The Apache camp buzzed with tension as word of Tenoch's declaration spread among the warriors and elders, their voices rising and falling like the desert wind as they debated the wisdom of his choice. Some spoke of the old ways, of the dangers of mixing their blood with that of their enemies, while others argued that the white woman's courage in coming to them showed a spirit worthy of respect. Tenoch listened to their concerns with the patience of a man who had already made his decision, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight as he waited for the storm of words to exhaust itself. When the eldest of the council finally asked him to explain his reasoning, he spoke of the strength he had seen in Clara's eyes, the fire that burned beneath her supposed curse, the way she had faced their judgment without flinching or begging for mercy. "She is not like the other white women," he said, his voice carrying across the circle of listeners like the call of a hunting hawk. "She has been tested by suffering and emerged stronger, not broken. Such a woman would bear strong children and stand beside her husband through any storm. The elders exchanged glances heavy with meaning, and Tenoch knew that while they might not approve, they would not stand in his way. The days that followed Clara's visit to the Apache camp passed like a fever dream, each one bringing new challenges and unexpected revelations as the two worlds she straddled began to shift and realign around her choice. The women of the town crossed the street to avoid her, their faces set in masks of righteous disapproval, while the men watched her with a mixture of fascination and fear, as if she had become something dangerous and unpredictable. Her father grew more distant with each passing day, his eyes holding a sadness that cut her to the bone. But Clara forced herself to remain strong, knowing that any sign of weakness would be seized upon as proof that she was making a terrible mistake. She threw herself into the work of the ranch with renewed vigor, as if physical labor could somehow prepare her for the emotional battles that lay ahead. The cattle seemed to sense her restless energy, responding to her commands with unusual docility, and even the most stubborn horses gentled under her touch. It was as if her decision to claim her own destiny had awakened something powerful within her, a confidence that transformed everything she touched. As the weeks passed and autumn began its slow surrender to winter, Clara found herself changing in ways that went beyond mere confidence or determination. She began to see the world through different eyes, noticing the beauty in things she had previously overlooked, finding strength in solitude rather than loneliness in isolation. The desert that had once seemed harsh and unforgiving now revealed its subtle magnificence, its endless horizons, speaking to something wild and free within her soul. She started learning Apache words from a book she had found in the general store, practicing the unfamiliar sounds until they felt natural on her tongue, preparing herself for a life that would require her to become someone entirely new. The townspeople watched these changes with growing unease, sensing that they were losing whatever power they had once held over Thomas Johnson's strange daughter, and their whispers grew darker as winter approached. But Clara no longer cared what they thought or said, because she had found something worth fighting for, and she would not let their fear steal it away from her. Winter settled over El Paso like a grey blanket, bringing with it a cold that seemed to seep into the very bones of the earth and test the resolve of every living thing that dared to call the desert home. Clara watched the landscape transform from her bedroom window, the familiar browns and golds giving way to muted silvers and whites that made the world seem both smaller and more mysterious. The Apache camp had moved deeper into the mountains, following the ancient patterns of survival that had kept Tenoch's people alive for countless generations, and Clara felt their absence like a physical ache in her chest. But even as the miles between them grew, she carried his promise with her like a talisman against the growing hostility of the town, a source of warmth that no winter wind could extinguish. The months ahead would test them both in ways they could not yet imagine, but Clara had learned to find strength in waiting, to see patience not as passive endurance, but as active preparation for the life that awaited her. Each day brought her closer to spring, closer to the moment when she would have to choose between the safety of the known and the terrifying beauty of the unknown. The isolation that winter brought was both a blessing and a curse, giving Clara time to think and plan, while also forcing her to confront the full weight of what she was contemplating. The townspeople had largely given up their open hostility, replacing it with a cold indifference that was somehow worse than their active disapproval, as if she had already ceased to exist in their world. Her father spoke to her only when necessary, his eyes holding a pain that cut deeper than any harsh word could have, and Clara felt the gulf between them widening with each passing day. She tried to bridge it with small gestures of affection and care, but Thomas Johnson seemed determined to mourn his daughter while she still lived, unable or unwilling to accept the woman she was becoming. The ranch work continued as it always had, the cattle needing care regardless of human drama, but even the familiar rhythms of daily life felt different now, charged with the electricity of impending change. Clara found herself memorizing every detail of her childhood home, storing up images and sensations against the day when they would become nothing more than memories. As the winter deepened and the snows came to the high country where Tenok's people had made their temporary home, Clara began to have dreams that felt more real than her waking hours. In these visions, she saw herself standing beside the Apache warrior in a ceremony that blended the traditions of both their peoples, her white dress flowing in the desert wind while eagle feathers adorned her hair. She dreamed of children with dark eyes and her stubborn chin, of a life lived close to the earth and far from the judgment of those who could not understand love that transcended the boundaries of race and culture. These dreams sustained her through the darkest days of winter, when the cold seemed to penetrate her very soul, and the weight of her choice threatened to crush her beneath its enormity. She would wake with tears on her cheeks and Tenok's name on her lips, reaching for a warmth that existed only in her imagination but felt more real than anything in her actual world. The dreams were both gift and torment, showing her what could be while reminding her of how far she still had to travel to reach it. The first signs of spring's approach came not with warmth, but with a subtle shift in the quality of the light, a softening around the edges that spoke of longer days and the earth's slow awakening from its winter sleep. Clara felt the change in her bones before she saw it with her eyes, a stirring of hope and anticipation that made her restless in ways she had not experienced since her visit to the Apache camp. She began to prepare for Tenok's return with the methodical care of a woman who understood that her entire future hung in the balance of the choices she would make in the coming weeks. Her father watched these preparations with growing alarm, finally understanding that his daughter's infatuation with the Apache warrior was not a passing fancy, but a commitment that would reshape both their lives forever. The conversations between them grew more strained and desperate, Thomas pleading with her to reconsider, while Clara remained steadfast in her determination to honor the promise she had made to herself and to the man who had seen her true worth. The ranch house that had once been filled with laughter and love now echoed with the sound of hearts breaking and dreams dying. Word came in early March that the Apache band had been spotted moving down from the winter camps, their horses and travois loaded with the possessions they had carried through the cold months in the high country. Clara received this news from a traveling merchant who spoke of seeing smoke from their fires and the distant figures of riders against the morning sky, and she felt her heart leap with a mixture of joy and terror that left her breathless. The moment she had been preparing for was finally at hand, and she realized that all her planning and dreaming had not truly prepared her for the reality of what she was about to do. That night, she sat with her father in the parlor where her mother had once sewn and sung lullabies, trying to find words that would help him understand why she had to leave everything familiar behind in pursuit of a love that defied every convention their world held sacred. Thomas Johnson listened with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, his hands shaking as he reached for the whiskey that had become his only comfort in these dark days. "You're all I have left of her," he whispered, his voice broken with grief and fear, and Clara felt her own heart shatter even as she held firm to her resolve. The morning that would change everything dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline beauty that made the desert look like a jewel set against the endless blue of the Texas sky. Clara rose before the sun, dressing carefully in her best dress and braiding her hair with the silver ribbon her mother had given her on her 16th birthday, preparing herself for a ceremony that would exist only in her heart and Tenok's eyes. She had left a letter for her father on the kitchen table, words of love and explanation that she hoped would someday help him understand why she had chosen this path, why the promise of spring had proven stronger than the bonds of blood and tradition. As she walked toward the place where she knew Tenok would be waiting, Clara felt the weight of her old life falling away like a snake shedding its skin, leaving her raw and new and ready to become whoever she was meant to be. The sun climbed higher in the sky above her, painting the world in shades of gold and possibility, and Clara Johnson walked toward her destiny with her head held high and her heart full of hope. Behind her, the town of El Paso slept on, unaware that one of its daughters was about to disappear into legend, becoming the woman who chose love over safety and found her home in the arms of a warrior who had promised to make her his wife by spring.